huge fan of Miguel's and the entire Skift platform. And it's an absolute pleasure for me to host Miguel today as we dive into our beloved event industry with all of you. And again, big warm welcome for joining us today. Miguel, how are you doing? Where are you joining us from?
Thank you very much, Saroosh. Thank you for the kind words. I am doing well, and I'm joining you from Denmark, from a little town called Sonnevildstrup in southern Denmark. And it's pretty cold here today, just above freezing, but yeah, doing well.
Very, very cool. Very cool. Great to, again, connect with you, Miguel. We've met intermittently over the last couple of years. And it's absolutely a pleasure, again, to host you today. I was very much looking forward to this. Today, I find myself in Montreal, and it is also very cold here. I think, dare I say, below freezing, right? So, but we're having a great time. Miguel, today, for our audience, we're going to cover a gamut of topics. I'll start us off by first asking you, Miguel, sitting where you sit as editor-in-chief of Skift, which is an authority in our industry, take us through a comparison of where the event industry is today versus 15 years ago, 20 years ago, right? And I have a few more follow-up questions to that. But how do you look at that industry from when you first joined, from the prevalence of tech to present time?
Sure. And you're focused more on the tech side or events in general? You want me to focus?
Events in general. We'll obviously from my side get into tech, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. I'm editor-in-chief of Skift Meetings, so speaking really much on the meetings and events side. I joined the industry in around 2007. I think that was a period of kind of opulence of the industry, very big events, a lot of stuff happening, things being very glamorous. But then, of course, you had the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and you had this big questioning and this big kind of, I think, come to terms of the industry in terms of ROI. I remember ROI becoming this big thing, and really, with Obama questioning whether events should be happening in Vegas and all these people should be having these flamboyant events, there was a big sort of reckoning among the industry. And I think there was a very down period for hotels for a couple of years there, where it really, it was really kind of questioning and people looking at the industry as wasteful, maybe over luxurious. And so there was a long sort of pickup from there where you had a lot of people focusing on ROI, a lot of people understanding how to make sure that people understood, that the general public understood the value of the meetings industry and the value of events. And so that was like a slow wave, and it started coming back slowly. And that was kind of like the big years for me when I really kind of got into the industry really deeply, the kind of junior years. I worked for IMEX for 6 years, and that was sort of like really trying to understand the industry of different players, the hotels, the venues, the destinations. I think it was a very positive time, and I think it was a constant sort of upswing all the way until 2019, 2020, when of course we had this little pandemic hit and everything went a little bit crazy. I think the industry went a bit upside down during those periods. Of course, for certain parts, at least of event tech, and certain parts of the industry was very good, but for the majority of the industry, of course, it was a bad time, and I think a lot of fear, a lot of tough times for a lot of people in the industry. So I definitely don't want to paint it in great colors. It was a tough time, but we had a couple of years there where virtual event tech was super strong. Companies went 10 times, sometimes 20 times in terms of the amount of business. Valuations went through the roof. We had the crazy Hopin story, for example, that we followed very closely, that went from being a platform created in 2019 to having a $7.75 billion valuation at its peak, and getting $450 million just in one round of funding, which was absolutely crazy. And still is, right? I don't see any event tech companies today getting anything like that. I think it was a very interesting moment in time. And now we have had a couple of years of sort of normalcy. I think in Asia, particularly China, things have recovered a little bit slower, I think, and then that has affected the whole region. But in general, the industry is now, by all measures, I think GBTA just put out some numbers that business travel has hit 2019 figures, and I think we're sort of back there. Of course, in terms of event design, in terms of the technology, in terms of the expectations of the attendees, there's no way of going back in time 5 years. That doesn't exist, right? And so I think that's an interesting topic in itself in terms of what do people expect today from events and from experiences, and happy to dive into. But that's sort of my view of the last 15 years. Exciting industry to be part of. In many ways, it's a very scattered industry. This is not an industry where, you need a specific license to operate. You need to operate under certain rules. And so that means it's very scattered. There's a lot of people doing great things. There's some people breaking the rules in good ways, some people breaking the rules in bad ways. So it is a scattered industry with a lot of verticals, and it's a hard industry to really justify all the time. And I think that ROI question is a tough one even today, because I think anybody in the industry can answer that, can say very clearly why it's a good industry and why it's worth investing in it. But I think for a lot of people outside the industry, it's still somewhat of an invisible industry. And I don't think a lot of people consider it an industry at all. They see it as part of functions within companies, functions within associations. And it's tough to address that, right? It's tough to really battle that. I don't know if we can, but anyway, going in lots of different directions. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of my view of the last 15 years.
Really appreciate that, Miguel. And, to your point, and we'll get into this, right, on the ROI point. And that gets into the tech side of things on the event industry. Now you have ROI calculators, right, where you can put a monetary value on a meeting, right? So if I'm hosting an event with 100 meetings, each meeting has a potential of a $5,000, revenue, and I multiply that. So, things like that we're offering, and the industry is also utilizing. So I think that's for the good, right? We're seeing that. Miguel, I have to ask you this before we go further. What brought you into the event domain, right? So you mentioned you worked at IMEX, but what made Miguel Neves get into the event industry as a whole? Give me the background on that, please.
Sure. I don't know how long you wanted to talk about my story, but so
I have a lot of time.
I'm from Portugal originally, and I used to be in music. I used to be on stage playing, production, studio work, that kind of thing. I always thought I was going to be in the music industry, but it turns out the music industry in Portugal is very, very small, and there's not a huge amount of money to be made in the music industry, and it was tough to make a living. So I ended up running or helping to run a few events. I actually was part of the team at the MTV European Music Awards in 2005. And that was a really interesting experience for me because I witnessed this amazing project management behind the scenes. Because what happened at these events would be all the MTV offices from all around the world would come together on site and sort of build their own studios, because they have channels in South America and different countries in Europe and the US, etc. And they would all have their own studios, and they'd all come together to produce this 2-hour live show and do some preview stuff, etc. And there was some stargazing, some famous acts, and it was kind of fun in that respect. But what I was really impressed with was the teamwork, was how much they really built offices backstage. They had trucks of furniture come in to furnish the rooms, and they had this amazing catering company, and that whole production around it I was very impressed with. And then I ended up working on a number of different smaller corporate events, incentives, those kind of things, and I always thought about how impressive it was to really bring something like that together and make it work. And so I became quite passionate about events, and then I realized that I could get the same buzz from running an event that I could from doing a concert and being on stage or producing. So it was like a transition from music production into events, and then it never really stopped.
Front facing to the other side. But that's a wonderful story, Miguel. We all have our own stories of how we got into the domain, but really excited to hear that. And you had some good exposure.
Tell us your story. How did you get into the domain?
So Miguel, I'm a nerd, a self-professed nerd, and I personally had an experience where me and my friends, we had a weekend planned in New York City about 10 years ago. And the story goes where I was responsible for coordinating everything, and these guys were flying from LA and Arkansas, and we're going to hang out in New York. And it ended up being a very fragmented experience where we were attending this concert. I ended up buying the tickets, but then the airlines were a separate booking, the Uber was a separate experience, the parking and the hotels and the Airbnb. It was 10, 12 different transactions to attend one event. And that's where the Eventcombo idea was born, because I personally experienced that fragmentation. And we've had a couple of pivots in our history, but that's the origin story of how I personally experienced a pain, and we turned it into product. Where back then we partnered with Uber, with Airbnb, with Lyft, Parkways for parking lots, and we created the single ticket transaction where you're buying tickets and then you're also paying for parking. So that's my background and how we got into the event. And then of course now, almost 10 years later, we're not doing that anymore. And an example of how the industry pivots and evolves, right? Yeah. So that's my story, Miguel, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay, cool. Would love to hear maybe not stories, but people that are watching, if you want to let us know where you're watching from. We would love to kind of see different parts of the world that you're watching from. Just put your location in the chat. I would love to see that. But don't let me stop you, Saroosh. Saroosh, go on.
No, I appreciate that. So Miguel, in terms of where the trends are, so folks use the word emerging trends, right? I like to say evolutionary trends, right? Because trends are born out of evolution, right? And by way of innovation, obviously we're going to discuss AI and how that's playing a role here. But I wanted to touch a little bit on the growth of the market, right? And now I'm speaking from our event tech domain, and I would love to hear Skift Meetings' perspective on this, where 70% of event professionals are expecting budgets to increase, right, in 2025. And there's a lot more money being poured into the space. And what you said is true also, right? There's a stigma around events. There's a low barrier to entry. And I think there's a devaluation of the power of events. But even still, you've got a whole side to this where organizations are spending a lot of money going into their event budgets versus their traditional budgets, or both. So with that growth, where do you think AI is going to play a role? And where do you think the industry is headed from continued validation of the fact that events are a big part of any business, right? Every organization does events, right? But the value that they place on it. So two questions. Number one, where do you think we're headed from a trend perspective on the technology side, meeting, software, AI, and so forth? And number two, how do you think we can do a better job in placing a higher value and respect behind event managers and the events that they produce? Right?
Yeah, I think I'd probably take the second question first, if that's okay. I think we can go on the AI traveling for a while, but I think budgets are increasing. We're not that sure the budgets are increasing enough because the costs around events are also increasing. Having said that, a lot of companies are moving money around budgets in different ways, and I think that's happening. This is a general trend because there's a recognition of the power of events, particularly on the bottom of the funnel, particularly how events and particularly kind of, in-person, smaller scale events can be incredibly effective at getting those high-end leads, those really kind of creating those relationships. I think that's really fascinating. I think on the other end of that is the kind of the virtual event or the webinar side of things. They can be more top of funnel for, using content, for sending the right message out. So there's a double kind of area, but I think the bottom of the funnel, I'm hearing a lot from marketers that's where they see the real ROI. They see like events as something that can really create relationships and really get the sales done and get the work done that they need to do. So, happy to hear that. And I think that's a really interesting area. I think marketing is embracing the idea of field marketing and idea of just using events in many different ways. So it's a really interesting time there. I think we're still far away. I think one thing I see online a lot is this idea, like people go to marketing conferences, the big ones, the inbounds, the Salesforces, and there's like one or two sessions about events. Like it's still seen as a very separate thing. And that I think is a challenge because on one side you're battling to make people recognize that it's a separate industry. And then on one side, you're kind of saying, okay, if it's not a separate industry, then we should be part of marketing, right? Or other things. And we're also not. So it's tough to play that game. But I think internally, in terms of budgets, in terms of the marketing teams, in terms of the logistics teams, I think there is a recognition that events are important. So I don't see any issues with getting investment around events. I don't know if there's enough investment to really increase that budget, but I think the investment in event technology is reasonably safe. And I think you've alluded to that a little bit in terms of how it can prove ROI, how you can track things, how you can gather data relatively easily with technology. So I think marketers get that. C-level suites get that. It's like, how do we make sure these relationships are, in our CRM, they're confirmed, they actually get us a business. Well, events are like the way to do that, and then we need technology to track that and make that work for us. So yeah, pretty bullish about that. Pretty confident that that's the way forward.
An observation, right? And I've heard this from our team. It's an interesting phenomenon where you have Fortune 100 companies that are putting on events, and their event department, like the folks that are actually producing events, is like 2 people. So it's interesting to observe that, right? Where you've got such a powerful vehicle in an event, and you've got so much, potential for impact and ROI, but yet, and this is what I was saying earlier about the undervalue, right? Is you're only allocating 2 resources to it. And then this goes into a different tangent altogether, but the stress factor, the workload, the weekends, the nights, and all those things come into play. So I wanted to just highlight that fact as well, is that even from a resource allocation perspective, companies, and a lot of them allocate properly, but a lot of companies still don't, right? So you have those dynamics at play too. But I think, again, that's part of the evolution, right?
No, I agree. And I think it's, unfortunately, it's probably one of those things that's only going to change if things fail, right? And we don't want to see things fail, but at some point companies need to recognize like, hey, this is not enough, right? Just two people managing all this, and there's a lot of stress, a lot of friction happening right now, and hopefully we can solve that and be more sustainable in the way we build events and build event teams.
Yeah, we see that in our client base is they're overwhelmed from their side, right? And anyway, just highlighting another topic there. But yeah, on the AI side, Miguel, would love to hear your insight.
Where to start? I mean, there's so much going on, right?
The buzzword, yeah, but let's dive.
I've been doing some work on trying to figure out AI, both from a macro perspective and from a detail perspective. I think every event tech company out there is integrating AI into how they do things. I mean, of course, why wouldn't they, right? And I think the integration runs the gamut, right? You have this like writing assistant or something that's relatively basic where you're doing some sort of like, you need to write an email or you need to create a landing page for an event, and then you can tap into ChatGPT to just help you do that. And maybe there's like a plugin within the event, or maybe it sort of just, has like a form or something within the platform. Relatively simple integrations, I think useful. And that kind of gets us into that kind of like prompt engineering. If you know how to prompt generative AI, it can help you do so many different things. And I've had this conversation with people where they'll share with me like, oh, I have a list of 500 prompts. That's great, but I don't know if that's really that helpful, right? It's sort of like saying, look, I have Excel and it does all these formulas. And I'm like, that's great. I don't know if that really helps me, right? So there's, you can do amazing things with generative AI and with ChatGPT and all other, Claude and all the other generative AI kind of chatbots out there. And that's great. And there's, the other side of event tech is the companies that have done their own AI that, especially on the matchmaking side, there's been a lot of work on AI quite a few years ago before ChatGPT and all these kind of things. So there's companies that really have AI embedded into their platform, and how they work and what they do. And then everybody else is kind of trying to figure out, because it is incredibly useful. Now, from a sort of more macro perspective, I think that there's much bigger trends. And I think the big trend that I'm really interested in is how user behavior is changing, right? And, Google is such a big thing. I Google something, right? You don't really say I search something, I Google something. You can interchange those two things. But I really see a world where we stop Googling and we start ChatGPTing, or we start Siriing, or whatever it is, right? And one of the main advantages of that is because Google is so reliant on ads that whenever you Google something, you also have to deal with all the ads, and you get tracked and you do all those kind of things. And, just to give you a really silly example, today I was like, okay, how many minutes does it take to soft boil an egg? And obviously I could Google that and it would give me some blog post about boiling eggs, and I'd go in and figure it out. But I just asked ChatGPT and it gave me very succinctly 4 minutes for, a very runny egg, 5 minutes for, and you just are like, that's all I need. So immediately that one Google search that I used to do, I stopped doing. And I think when you expand that for pretty much everything you do on a workday that you would normally Google, when you stop doing that, it becomes like an AI, right? And I think that has a fundamental shift in how we use tools. And I'm starting to think that AI and generative AI will be more like an operating system than a platform.
Yes.
If you imagine having not a Windows or a Mac, you have an OpenAI terminal, and everything you do is basically using ChatGPT. And then the only thing that you're missing is probably some sort of file system where you could save your work in some way. But other than that, you could just live within, you could just do all your work within a sort of generative AI platform. Call it ChatGPT just to make it simple. Sure. That's a big change, right? Because it can also code for you. And I think that's a big shift for event technology companies. If I'm kind of saying, hey, I'm just running an event for 20 people, I don't need a whole registration system, but could you just code a little registration page for me and create a badge template that I can print out 10 badges? Like ChatGPT can actually do that. And so you're removing the need for specific platforms. And so if that really goes in that direction, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't, then at least, for simple stuff, it's sort of replacing. And then it's finding ways on how it can complement. In a world where we're very ChatGPT based, when do we then jump off to a different platform? And how does that platform enhance what I need or do what I need for me. And I think that's kind of a different mind shift and understanding how to play well with ChatGPT so that you are a nice extension of that, really. I don't know if that makes sense, if that's where you wanted me to go, but I'd love to hear your response to that, because it sounds like you're agreeing, but I'm sure you have other views.
Yeah, of course. I'm very eager to dive into this topic for obvious reasons, Miguel. I think what you're saying resonates, right? I think we're moving away from automation into personalization, right? I think, the flashy, gadgety use cases are exciting and purposeful. But I think the fact is how can it benefit us as an individual, as a business, as an event manager, as an attendee, and I think we're moving away. We're seeing it. We're moving away from the automation side because that's a means to an end, right? To a personalization side. And you mentioned some examples, right, where I want information. I can rarely get that, but I want this tool to actually perform an act for me, perform a task for me, that helps me get from point A to point B, right? And not just from point A to point B, but for me personally, right? And it helps me build my own personal momentum. So I think from a tool set perspective, we're starting to see that happen. Your, boiling an egg scenario is a perfect example of that, where, you historically were doing that in Google, now you're doing it using AI. I think that's just going to get accelerated over the few months. And then when we were talking offline, Miguel, we're discussing industry trends and so forth, right? But this is one of the industry trends that we see as Eventcombo, where our clients are seeking personalization. And obviously, they want to automate their workflows, right? They want to type in what they want on the registration form and have the registration form generate for them. They want to type in what they want on their event website, and the event website gets built for them. We're now at a stage where we're moving beyond those functionalities into how can I make this easier for my attendees? How can I track their behavior, and how can I make the experience more personalized for them? And that is a challenge that obviously we're embracing, but it's a challenge. How this plays out over the next year, 2, 3, 4 years is going to be interesting. The other dynamic is as a software provider, Eventcombo and all of our wonderful competitors, you can integrate into existing AI engines, right? But do you build your own event-specific AI engine, right? That's a question, right? And the cost to benefit ratio there is something we're evaluating. But I think that's where you really see some amazing things happening when you're not using existing LLMs. You're actually creating a unique approach yourself. That's
where do you see the big advantages there? Like, what does that enable you to do than using an existing LLM doesn't?
So I think an existing LLM lets you do everything, right? I mean, there's really, as far as the evolution goes in January 2025, there isn't any limitation with an existing LLM. But we don't know what we don't know, right? The virtual is an example of that. Like right now, we're in our Fireworks tool, shameless plug, and this is not the way it looked 4 years ago, 5 years ago, right? It looked very much differently. But at the time, it's same thing with Hopin and all these other tools. At the time, we're like, oh my God, this is amazing. But fast forward 4 or 5 years, it's even more amazing. So we don't know what we don't know, but I do know that building your own versus integrating into an existing tech stack it has some inherent virtues, right? We know that ourselves from tools that we integrate into versus us building it our own. We have more authority, more creativity, more more value basically for the end user, and no restrictions basically, right? Because then you can kind of do everything. So I don't think there's any limitation on the current LLMs, but I think we will encounter limitations only once we start building our own, right? We'll start discovering new solutions ourselves. But that's a big investment. That's a pretty big investment, right? And,
of course, you have the security, the data security, right? That once you kind of have your own, then it's a very different premise, right? Like nothing, no company secrets are going on to OpenAI servers.
Exactly, and that's a risk, right? You have compliance, you have data, you have privacy, all those criteria that you have to satisfy. So I think where it's headed from a personalization standpoint is when I walk into an event right now, I get my badge, right? It tells me my name, it tells me my job title, tells me which sessions I'm in, has my QR code on it, right? That's a manual process, right? Our clients, event managers who are using software are manually getting that data from attendees and then using software to print that data, right? There is a world out there, and we're starting to see it, where that data is just automatically available. It's not even entered by anyone manually, by any human. It's just available because the systems are now speaking to each other in a very transparent way. So that's one example of personal, dietary preferences, allergies, things like that, right? Which are, again, hotel lodging preferences and bookings. All of those things, I think in the next 2 years, mark my words, it's going to be all, one click away or one simple.
I look forward to that. So one example that I always give of, people say, oh, personalization is happening. I'm like, well, it's not quite there yet. And one example I always give is when I get on a flight and I sit down in my seat, like if it's a long haul flight, you get your little in-flight entertainment, right? And the airline knows who you are. They have your membership number, they have your things. Why can't I have my preferences? Like you spend like hours selecting the films that you want to watch on a flight, and then you go to the return flight and you have to do it all again. And they're the same films. Like, why can't the airline just remember? And when I sit down at my seat, just say like, hey, welcome, Miguel. You have a kosher meal or whatever it is that you chose. And we know that you like these films, so we've pre-selected these for these. But they don't. Even if you fly in first class, not that I fly in first class, but if I'm aware of, they don't do that yet. And it's like, we're so close, but yet we're not quite there yet.
Right, exactly. But it's coming though, Miguel, from your mouth to the airlines, right? It's coming. And again, as organizations, they have budgets, right? They allocate, and I think they're playing catch up, right? As is always the case, right? I think they will definitely catch up. The event industry is no different. I think there's a lot of start introducing, using the world, we will start introducing these innovations. Love your analogy, by the way. Obviously, it's a perfect example of how you can avoid time. It's a headache. Every time I check in, I have to just re-enter everything all over again. No matter what airline it is, these airline apps, I have to just type in my password again, my passport ID. It shouldn't be so arduous, right? It shouldn't be so difficult. But I think it's a catch-up game also. But we, as tech providers, I think we have to just keep pushing that envelope. Right? Let's see where that takes us. Miguel, I was just reminded we have some questions from the audience, right? I guess I'll articulate them and would love your response, Miguel. How important? Thank you, Sophia. How important is personalization in event planning, and what tools or techniques can be used to achieve it? Yeah, so I think me and Miguel were just kind of discussing that. I see that was asked a few minutes ago, so maybe that was answered already. But I think Miguel gave a great example, right? If there's predetermined preferences from an attendee and that data is readily available and accessible, then it's our job to make it useful and purposeful versus it being very binary where it's just flat data, it's not doing anything, and you have to manually lift it from point A to point B. So I think if automatically it'll happen, that'll introduce the simple personalization. Miguel, anything you want to add to that question?
Personalization is one of our trends, and I think AI is beginning to deliver on the promise of personalization. I spoke to a few people in the industry about this, and what's interesting is that it's not generative AI that necessarily does this. There's other types of AI. There's predictive AI that really help with this kind of functionality. And so it's a bit of it's not like the ChatGPT that's going to solve it. Having said that, one of the issues is, are events really ready for personalization? So let me put that into context. So my dream of a personalized event is that the app functions a little bit like Tinder, like something that's so, and I'm not really a Tinder user. I'm not really an expert, but I understand the very basic way of working, right? You see someone that you think you want to be matched with. And I'm thinking from a networking perspective and also from a content, like finding sessions that you're interested in. You see somebody that you might want to be matched with, you swipe left or you swipe right. You see a list of sessions that you might want to go to, you swipe right, you swipe left. That's it. That's what I want, right? And I want it to just work. And I want the suggestions to be really good. And then I want, whenever I swipe left or right, whichever is like accepting, I want that to kind of immediately build my agenda, or to immediately like sort of try to connect with those people and sort of try to set up some time, right? Once you get to that level, I think personalization becomes really interesting, because we've been saying that event technology can do this for a long time. And yes, it all depends on the quality of the data that's input. You need people to be okay with sharing a certain amount of information. You need the questions to be set up properly. So there's a lot of work to be done in the background. But in the foreground, when you're using the apps, that's what I want to see as a user. And those are the results that I want to get. And I think if we can actually deliver that, the event that can actually deliver that and the tools that can actually deliver that, they're going to start differentiating that event from the other ones, right? Because if you go to an event that has an app that's that easy to use and it really works and it really does make a better use of your time, and then you go to a trade show that doesn't have an app and you're just lost, you're going to go like, I don't want to be here, right? I want to be at the other event. And so I think that is a massive differentiator that I think people really need to invest in. Now, what does it take to achieve it? I think, Saroosh, you could probably explain that better. I know that data is super important, clean, concise data, having the confidence of the users that they'll say, yes, I'll put my data in and I know that it's going to be used in a positive way is really important as well, right?
And of course, Miguel, I think it's our responsibility to keep introducing these things. I think as a service provider, it's based on demand, right? You have R&D, which is future oriented, and you have immediate products and features that are available and you keep delivering. But a lot of it's based on client demand, right? What are clients asking for? So it's got to be, as a service provider, you have to have a balanced approach. What does the market demand today? You have to provide that, obviously, and we're doing our best to do that. And then what is the market going to ask for tomorrow? That's a little bit of a predictive stance, and therein lies the risk, right? Is you may invest in, and this has happened to many companies where they throw out a product without having done the proper due diligence, and the 80-20 rule is not applied, and next thing you know, you have a feature that's just collecting dust. So we've learned, obviously, to base it on demand and market signals, right? What are some signals that we're receiving today that we can make predictions on 6 months from now, 1 year from now, right? So those are some tactics we use to implement and deploy new features, and obviously we'll continue doing that. Miguel, I want to discuss meetings as well, because right now I know we're kind of in the AI topic, but before we do meetings, I think Noah also asked about data analytics evolving in the planning and execution of events in your future. I think, and thank you, Noah, I think it's kind of like what me and Miguel are starting to get into is, what role does data play? And we're seeing it across our client base. Every single organization is now very bullish on data and privacy, right? There was a time where that was not at the forefront, but now that is at the forefront, right? They want it in writing as far as where the data is going to be stored. It's not leaving such and such border. Is it encrypted at rest, in transit? I mean, all these things, and we're excited by that because it means that proper channels have acknowledged the importance of data and preventing its abuse and so forth. So another example for you is there was a time where a lot of clients would ask for social media integrations, where we want to be integrated into LinkedIn, Facebook, and all this. We're seeing the opposite. A lot of clients are like, say, we don't want any of our attendee data to touch these social media platforms. Again, that's an evolutionary trend, right? Yeah. So I think data analytics combined with tech culture, right? I think, and the horror stories we hear, right? But Target being hacked and all the customers' data being breached. I think we've all learned from those, and they'll continue happening, right? Unfortunately. But I think we've all learned from those, and I think we all, as tech providers, take data very seriously. But from a personalization perspective, it's obvious, right? You know the preferences of the attendee, and you then build solutions from a functional standpoint and a technical standpoint to make it a personalized experience.
I think.
But Miguel, did you want to add anything to that? Two more things.
Yeah, I think data analytics. Look, I think data analytics is a huge topic. We could, speak for hours. But I think for me, what's important about data is what you can do with it, right? One of the things that I find really exciting with generative AI is that you can take open fields, for example, in survey questions and that kind of thing, and you can feed them to generative AI and help you make sense of those and kind of see how, what the top topics are and kind of bunch them up into sections, etc., and like group things. And when you're talking about thousands of data points, that's super valuable, because the issue with collecting data, particularly at in-person live events, is that if the data collection method is not, perfect, or it's not like, you can't make mistakes, then you get imperfect data, right? And when you're tracking, for example, people moving around a room, badges getting scanned, that kind of thing, I think like if you're scanning badges at an entrance, that's pretty reliable. But if you're depending on people scanning badges at a booth, for example, that doesn't always work, right? Unless you're like that really super annoying kind of exhibitor where the first thing you do is you scan the badge. It's going to be a bit tricky because people are going to shy away. Some people are going to walk away. There's all sorts of things. And so the physical data that you get from events is not always perfect, right? And so relying on that or kind of making that like your only source is tricky. But if you can get things like survey questions and make surveys short, but say, hey, what's your favorite thing? What did you really not like? And then collate all those answers into something that's really useful. Then you're not really getting analytics anymore. You're getting business insights, right? And that's super valuable. So for me, I'm always thinking when I'm thinking planning and data analytics is like, how do I turn that into something really useful? What question is this going to be able to answer for me? And when you can do that, then I don't think anybody doesn't want data. Everybody wants more data, but you also want to make sure you can understand what that data is telling you, because data is data. right? And then it's like,
Yeah.
what is it saying? And interpreting that data is not always linear. You know, a lot of people make big assumptions, and so kind of understanding that data is super important. So I think that's the next part of that.
No, absolutely agreed. It begins and ends with data, right, Miguel, and how you process it and analyze it. Miguel, again, on the AI topic, and this is a great topic too. We'll get back to some questions. I wanted to obviously Skift Meetings, right? You're again the authority, in my opinion, in the space. Over the last year, we've seen a significant increase in demand for the meetings component of an event, right? So we're now looking at meetings as micro events within an event, and we look at events now as a macro meeting, right? So that's how we're kind of approaching it as far as, you know, again, being a service provider. So our position is that meetings are micro events and events are macro meetings. Having established that foundation, right, Miguel, what do you attribute this is, again, from our point of view, this increase in demand for matchmaking, for meetings, for defining? I gave you that example earlier where, you know, we want to put a monetary value on a meeting, and then we want to make as many meetings happen as possible. But from a Skift Meetings perspective, how are meetings playing a role in the evolution of the event space? And where do you see this going into 2026, 2027? Will events cease happening and will meetings just take over? Or you know, I would love to hear your insight into this meeting.
Sure, and I think part of that is also just the names that we give things. Like I usually talk about the meetings industry, and when I say meetings industry, I mean like all types of events, you know, from trade shows to small events. But I would go back to that point of bottom of the funnel. I think when you're actually able to meet somebody face to face at an event, that's when you're really getting the most value, and that face to face time is super important. And whenever we can use technology to make sure that face-to-face time is used really efficiently, then it really works. And there's also like a cost pressure, right? Events are expensive, you travel, there's all these things. So companies really want to get the most ROI from exhibiting, but also like if they're buyers and they're looking to find the right suppliers, they want to make sure that they can find them really efficiently. And so that efficiency of finding the right meetings, that's, I think, what's driving it. We went through a period of, you know, our trade shows, for example, are as many people going to come to trade shows as they did before the pandemic. The numbers are looking pretty similar right now. They're still a little bit lower in most industries. They're still a little bit behind. But the argument is that the more senior people, like less junior people are going, more senior people are going, more decision makers are going. I don't know if that's exhibition companies just sort of, you know, coming up with excuses. I don't know if there's, you know, data that really proves that. But as long as the exhibitors and the sponsors are getting the ROI that they're looking for, then those things will continue to grow, right? And so, yes, I'm fully with you. And I think what's going to happen is the mega events are going to continue to grow because exactly of that idea that everybody who really matters is there. And then within those mega events, you can have those meetings with the people that really matter. And then these kind of small, very focused events, I think have a huge opportunity for, you know, curating a very targeted audience of only the people that really make sense to meet each other and have very, very curated meetings. I think the challenge is for the events that fall somewhere in between. You know, when you're talking about like regional events that are sort of like the big event, but there's a bigger event that's not too far away that sort of has everybody there. I think it's going to be really hard to market that smaller event as like, oh, but we're more focused, we're more regional. I think that those kind of events are really going to have to pivot and really do something, you know, like really innovative to make sure that people see a different type of value in being there. Because if they're just competing on size, you know, for good or bad, I think the size is a really tough one to compete with.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Miguel. Great insight there. Miguel, just keeping time in mind, I wanted to just ask you a couple of fun questions. I think we've obviously had great discussion on the topic of meetings and events and AI and trends and so forth, and I hope the audience found it to be valuable. But Miguel, a couple of questions for you. If you could host an event anywhere in the world, right? Any city in the world, where would it be and why? Or a meeting?
Well, that's a tough one. So many different places. I think I'd go back to where I'm from, Portugal, and probably pick somewhere quite remote. I'm a big fan of events that are, you know, like remote. You have to go there, you have to sort of travel, and then when you're there, you're really there in person, you're really focused. Maybe somewhere in the south of Portugal, in the Algarve, like in a sort of a remoter region, a sort of a less obvious region, maybe Davida, somewhere like that. I think that's where I'd go. Really try to get a sense of the place and really, you know, a lot more of that retreat kind of feeling. I think that would be a lot of fun. Gotcha.
I hope the tourism board there is listening to you, and I hope they appreciate your shout out there.
Why not?
I appreciate that. Miguel, it's been such a pleasure. And I want to thank you for your time. And again, just I've been a huge fan of yours and Skift Meetings, and I'm looking forward to seeing more content that you'll be putting out there. And looking forward to many more interactions, Miguel. Thank you again.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Thanks, everyone. See you all soon. Thanks.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Miguel.